In the cold, merciless waters of the North Atlantic, a silent killer prowled beneath the waves. It struck without warning, sending thousands of tons of steel and cargo to the ocean floor in minutes. The U-boat, Germany's underwater assassin, was winning a war that few could see, strangling Britain's lifeline and threatening to bring the world's greatest empire to its knees. But what Hitler's Kriegsmarine didn't know was that a revolution in technology and intelligence was brewing, one that would transform hunters into hunted and turn the tide of the entire Second World War. The Battle of the Atlantic stands as the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, spanning from September 1939 to the defeat of Nazi Germany in May 1945. It was a brutal war of attrition, fought across millions of square miles of ocean, where merchant convoys carrying vital supplies from North America to Britain faced constant assault from German U-boats, surface raiders, and aircraft. Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the war. The stakes could not have been higher. Britain, an island nation, depended entirely on maritime imports for survival. Food, fuel, weapons, raw materials, everything needed to sustain the British people and their war effort had to cross the Atlantic. If the Germans could sever this lifeline, Britain would be forced to surrender, regardless of how bravely the Royal Air Force had fought in the skies or how determined Churchill's speeches rang out across the radio waves. In the early years of the war, the advantage belonged decisively to the Kriegsmarine. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet, had developed devastating tactics that exploited every weakness in Allied defenses. His submarines hunted in coordinated groups called wolf packs, shadowing convoys by day and attacking en masse at night when they were nearly impossible to detect on the surface. The Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, was a masterpiece of engineering for its time. With a range of over 8,000 miles, it could patrol far into the Atlantic, while its torpedoes carried enough explosive power to break a merchant ship in half. These submarines were fast enough on the surface to outrun most escort vessels and could dive to depths that made them difficult to destroy even when detected. German submariners were highly trained, motivated, and led by experienced commanders who had honed their skills in the opening months of the war. They called the period from July 1940 to the spring of 1941 the happy time, and with good reason. Allied merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced, with U-boats often operating with near impunity. The human cost was staggering. Merchant seamen faced perhaps the most dangerous job of the entire war. When a torpedo struck, there were usually only seconds to react before a ship began its final plunge. Men were thrown into frigid waters, many coated in burning oil from ruptured fuel tanks. Those who survived the initial sinking faced hypothermia, with death often coming within minutes in the icy Atlantic. Lifeboats offered only marginal protection, and rescue, if it came at all, might take days. Survivors spoke of watching their shipmates disappear beneath the waves, of the screams that haunted their dreams for the rest of their lives. Between 1939 and 1945, over 30,000 merchant seamen from Allied nations lost their lives, along with thousands more from the Royal Navy and other naval forces tasked with protecting the convoys. The Kriegsmarine paid its own terrible price. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 would never return home, the highest casualty rate of any service in the German military. But even as the Wolfpacks celebrated their victories in 1940 and early 1941, the seeds of their ultimate defeat were already being planted. In laboratories across Britain, Canada, and eventually the United States, scientists and engineers were developing technologies that would revolutionize naval warfare. These innovations, radar, sonar, radio direction finding, and breaking of German codes, would ultimately tip the balance of the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet technology alone would not be enough. It would take new tactics, improved training, increased production of escort vessels and aircraft, and the gradual accumulation of operational experience to translate technological advantage into battlefield success. The story of radar begins before the war, with experiments conducted independently in several countries. Radar, short for radio detection and ranging, works by transmitting radio waves and detecting their reflections from distant objects. By measuring the time it takes for a radio pulse to return, operators can determine the distance to a target. The direction of the antenna, when the reflection is strongest, reveals the target's bearing. The British had been developing radar systems for air defense since the mid-1930s, driven by the terrifying prospect of German bombers attacking British cities. By 1940, the chain-home radar network along Britain's coast could detect incoming aircraft at ranges of over 100 miles, providing precious minutes of warning that proved crucial during the Battle of Britain. Adapting radar for naval use presented different challenges. Ships pitch and roll in ways that buildings on land do not, requiring more robust equipment. The curvature of the Earth limits the range at which surface vessels can detect one another, and radar waves follow similar limitations. Most critically for anti-submarine warfare, radar could not penetrate seawater. A surfaced U-boat could be detected, but once it dived, it became invisible to radar. Nevertheless, naval radar proved enormously valuable. Early systems could detect surfaced U-boats at ranges of several miles, even at night or in fog when visual detection was impossible. This capability directly countered Donitz's wolf-pack tactics, which relied on U-boats servicing at night to attack convoys. With radar, escort vessels could detect these surfaced submarines and either drive them under, forcing them away from the convoy, or attack them directly. The development of centimetric radar, operating at wavelengths of around 10 centimeters rather than the earlier 1.5-meter wavelengths, marked a crucial breakthrough. This technology, based on the cavity magnetron invented by British physicists in 1940, allowed for much smaller antennas and more precise target location. Centimetric radar sets could be fitted to aircraft, enabling them to detect surfaced U-boats from the air. This seemingly simple capability had profound consequences. U-boats needed to spend significant time on the surface to charge their batteries and refresh their air supply. They also traveled much faster on the surface, allowing them to reach attack positions ahead of convoys. By forcing submarines to remain submerged, Allied aircraft equipped with centimetric radar dramatically reduced the operational effectiveness of the U-boat fleet. A submarine traveling submerged on battery power could make only about 7 to 9 knots, compared to 17 knots or more on the surface. This speed reduction meant U-boats often could not reach favorable attack positions, and their batteries would eventually force them to surface where they risked detection and attack. The Germans were slow to realize that the Allies had developed centimetric radar. U-boat crews reported being attacked from the air with uncanny accuracy, even in complete darkness or heavy cloud, but German naval intelligence initially attributed these incidents to superior Allied skill or coincidence rather than a technological breakthrough. This intelligence failure cost the Kriegsmarine dearly. By the time the Germans understood what they were facing and developed detector equipment to warn U-boats of radar emissions, the Allies had already gained a significant advantage. Even then, German countermeasures often proved inadequate. The Metox radar detector, introduced in mid-1942, could detect some Allied radar transmissions, but its effectiveness was limited, and it could not detect the shorter wavelength centimetric radars at all. When an improved detector called Naxos was finally deployed in mid-1943, the critical period of the Battle of the Atlantic had already passed. While radar allowed the Allies to find surfaced U-boats, sonar, or ASDIC as the British called it, provided the means to detect and attack submerged U-boats. ASDIC, named after the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee that oversaw its development during World War I, worked on principles similar to radar but used sound waves instead of radio waves. An escort vessel equipped with ASDIC transmitted pulses of sound underwater. If these pulses struck a submarine, some of the sound energy would reflect back to the transmitting ship, where hydrophones would detect it. By measuring the time delay,
Operators could calculate the submarine's range and bearing. Early ESDIC systems had significant limitations. They had a maximum effective range of only about 1,500 yards under good conditions, and could not detect submarines beyond about 200 feet deep. The sound beam could not detect targets directly ahead during the final moments of an attack run, creating a dead zone that allowed skilled U-boat commanders to take evasive action. Water conditions greatly affected ESDIC performance. Temperature layers in the water could bend sound waves, creating shadow zones where submarines became invisible. And rough seas generated noise that interfered with detection.
Despite these limitations, ESDIC gave escort vessels a fighting chance against submerged U-boats. The key was persistent, methodical searching. When a submarine was detected, the escort would approach its speed and drop depth charges, barrels containing hundreds of pounds of high explosive set to detonate at a specific depth. A submarine did not need to suffer a direct hit to be damaged or destroyed. The tremendous pressure wave from a depth charge exploding nearby could rupture a submarine's hull, crack batteries, releasing deadly chlorine gas, or cause leaks that would eventually force the boat to surface. A typical depth charge attack involved dropping a pattern of 6 to 10 charges, spaced to cover an area of ocean where the submarine was believed to be. If the initial attack failed to destroy or cripple the submarine, the escort would regain sonar contact and attack again, and again, and again if necessary. Some U-boats endured depth charge attacks lasting hours or even days, with crews huddled in darkness, rationing air and water, listening to the explosions creeping closer with each attack run, praying their boat would hold together just a little longer. The technical sophistication of anti-submarine warfare improved continuously throughout the conflict. New weapons supplemented traditional depth charges. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar developed in 1941, fired a pattern of 24 small bombs ahead of the attacking ship, eliminating the dead zone problem of ESDIC. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at a preset depth regardless of whether they hit anything, Hedgehog bombs only exploded on contact with a submarine. This meant that if the attacking vessel heard no explosions, it knew the attack had missed and could immediately regain sonar contact for another attempt. When explosions did occur, they almost certainly indicated a dead submarine. The Hedgehog proved highly effective, with a kill rate substantially higher than conventional depth charge attacks. Improved depth charges also came into service. The more powerful minal-filled charges could damage submarines at greater distances from the detonation point. Shallow-set depth charges, which could explode at depths as little as 50 feet, proved effective against U-boats attempting to evade by running at shallow depth, where conventional depth charges set for deeper detonation would pass harmlessly beneath them. Perhaps most importantly, escort groups became more numerous and better coordinated as the war progressed. Instead of 2 or 3 escort vessels trying to protect a convoy of 30 or 40 merchant ships, a nearly impossible task, larger escort groups with 6, 8, or even more warships could provide layered defense. Some escorts would maintain station around the convoy, ready to respond to attacks, while others could pursue detected submarines aggressively, hunting them to destruction rather than merely driving them away. The third leg of the technological revolution that defeated the U-boats was radio intelligence, combined with cryptanalysis, the breaking of codes. German naval communications relied heavily on the Enigma cipher machine, a sophisticated electromechanical device that encrypted messages in a way the Germans believed was unbreakable. They were wrong. Polish mathematicians had made the first breakthroughs against Enigma in the 1930s, and when Poland fell in 1939, they shared their knowledge with the British. At the Government Code and Cipher School at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion 50 miles north of London, some of Britain's most brilliant minds worked to penetrate German codes. The effort, codenamed Ultra, represented one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Breaking Enigma was extraordinarily difficult. The machine had billions of possible settings, which changed daily, and the German Navy used additional security procedures that made their naval Enigma variants even more secure than those used by other German services. For much of 1941 and into 1942, Bletchley Park could not read German naval Enigma traffic in real time, limiting the operational value of the intelligence. However, when decrypts could be produced, they proved devastatingly effective. German U-boat command transmitted orders to submarines at sea via radio, directing wolfpacks to concentration points where convoys were expected. If the British could read these orders, they could route convoys around submarine patrol lines, avoiding contact entirely. The ultimate victory was not sinking U-boats, it was ensuring that merchant ships arrived safely with their cargoes intact.
The intelligence battle reached a critical point in May 1941, when the British captured an Enigma machine and codebooks from the German submarine U-110. This material, obtained at great risk during a depth charge attack that forced the U-boat to surface, provided Bletchley Park with the keys it needed to read German naval traffic. For most of the following year, Allied intelligence could penetrate German communications, allowing convoys to evade U-boat patrol lines. The effect on shipping losses was dramatic. Sinkings fell significantly even though U-boat numbers were increasing. But the intelligence advantage proved fragile. In February 1942, the Germans introduced a four-rotor version of the Enigma machine for Atlantic U-boats, instantly rendering previous British cryptanalytic techniques obsolete. For 10 months, Bletchley Park struggled to break the new cipher, while merchant ship losses climbed to catastrophic levels. The period from January to August 1942 became known as the second happy time for U-boat crews, with American waters now added to their hunting grounds following the United States' entry into the war. The blackout of intelligence coincided with other factors that made 1942 the crisis year of the Battle of the Atlantic. The United States initially failed to implement effective coastal convoy systems along its eastern seaboard, allowing U-boats to sink ships almost within sight of American cities. Production of escort vessels and anti-submarine aircraft had not yet reached the levels needed to provide adequate protection. New U-boats were entering service faster than the Allies could sink them. By November 1942, Allied shipping losses had reached a rate that, if sustained, would make it impossible to build up the forces needed for an eventual invasion of Europe. Britain's oil reserves were falling to dangerously low levels. The situation was becoming desperate. But the tide was about to turn. In December 1942, Bletchley Park finally broke the four-rotor naval Enigma, restoring Allied intelligence access to German U-boat communications. The United States Navy implemented coastal convoy systems, dramatically reducing losses in American waters. Long-range aircraft, particularly consolidated B-24 Liberator bombers equipped with centimetric radar and powerful searchlights, began to close the air gap in the mid-Atlantic where convoys had previously operated beyond the range of land-based aircraft. This gap had been a haven for U-boats, but now nowhere in the Atlantic was truly safe from air attack. The escort carrier, a small aircraft carrier built on a merchant ship hull, allowed convoys to bring their own air cover with them, even in the middle of the ocean. New escort vessels, particularly the destroyer escort and the corvette, were entering service in large numbers. These ships were specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare, with powerful sonar, ample depth charge capacity, and sufficient speed to chase down surfaced submarines. The accumulation of technological advantages combined with improved tactics and greater resources reached critical mass in the spring of 1943. March of that year saw savage convoy battles, with large wolf packs attacking multiple convoys and inflicting heavy losses. But the German success proved illusory. For every merchant ship sunk, the Allies were now destroying U-boats at a rate the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. In April and May 1943, U-boat losses skyrocketed. Over 40 submarines were sunk in 2 months, a catastrophic attrition rate that shook Donitz to his core.
On May 24, 1943, he made a decision that effectively acknowledged defeat in the Atlantic. He ordered all U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic convoy routes and cease operations until new tactics and technologies could restore the balance. The order came too late. The battle was already lost. The withdrawal did not mean the end of the U-boat threat. German engineers and scientists worked frantically to develop submarines that could operate submerged for extended periods, negating Allied air superiority. The Type 21 electroboat, with massive battery capacity and a streamlined hull optimized for underwater performance, represented a revolutionary leap in submarine design. If these boats had entered service in large numbers earlier in the war, they might have restored Germany's position in the Atlantic. But they came too late and in insufficient numbers. The Type 21 design influenced submarine development for decades after the war, but during the conflict itself, only a handful became operational and none achieved significant success.
Throughout 1943 and 1944, the Allies continued to refine and improve their anti-submarine capabilities. Operational research groups analyzed every aspect of anti-submarine warfare, seeking ways to increase effectiveness. They discovered that white-painted aircraft were less visible to U-boats than the standard gray, giving attackers a few extra seconds before being spotted, often the difference between a successful attack and a submarine that dived to safety. They calculated optimal depth charge patterns and fusing depths for different scenarios. They determined the most effective search patterns for hunting submarines in different circumstances. Every lesson learned was incorporated into training and operational procedures, creating a continuously improving system that became increasingly lethal to U-boats. The human dimension of this struggle must not be forgotten amid the discussion of technology and tactics. On both sides, men faced conditions of extraordinary danger and hardship. Allied merchant seamen sailed knowing that each voyage might be their last, that at any moment a torpedo could tear their ship apart. They went anyway, voyage after voyage, because Britain needed the supplies they carried. The sailors of the Royal Navy, the Royal Canadian Navy, and eventually the United States Navy, who escorted the convoys, faced exhausting duty in some of the most hostile waters on Earth. The North Atlantic in winter tests human endurance to its limits. Gales with 50-foot waves, freezing spray that coated ships in ice, darkness that lasted for most of the day. Men stood watch for hours in these conditions, scanning the horizon for periscopes or surfaced submarines, listening to sonar returns, knowing that a moment's inattention could mean death for themselves and the men they were protecting. For U-boat crews, conditions were arguably even worse. Submarines of World War II were cramped, damp, and foul-smelling. Dozens of men lived in spaces barely large enough for half that number. There was no privacy, little fresh food, and the constant knowledge that the thin steel hull separating them from the ocean was all that stood between life and death. When depth charges exploded nearby, the submarine would shudder and lights would flicker or go out entirely. Men would glance at their shipmates in the dim emergency lighting, wondering if the next explosion would be the one that cracked the hull. The psychological strain was immense. Many U-boat veterans spoke of the relief they felt when their boat was finally sunk and they were captured. The ordeal was over. They had survived, and they would not have to go to sea again. As the war ground on into 1944 and 1945, U-boat operations became increasingly desperate. Donitz continued to send U-boats into the Atlantic even as losses mounted and successes became rare. He hoped that by tying down substantial Allied resources in anti-submarine operations, the U-boats were still contributing to the German war effort. In a sense, he was correct. Hundreds of ships and aircraft and tens of thousands of personnel remained dedicated to anti-submarine warfare until the end of the war. But the cost to the Kriegsmarine was devastating. By 1944, U-boat crew survival rates had fallen below 30%. New recruits were rushed through training to replace the mounting casualties, but this only made matters worse. Inexperienced crews were even more likely to be detected and destroyed.
The average operational life of a U-boat in 1944 was measured in weeks, not months. The final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic saw German submarines equipped with snorkel devices that allowed them to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged at periscope depth. This technology partially negated Allied radar advantages, as boats no longer needed to surface fully to charge batteries. However, the snorkel's limitations were severe. The submarine could only travel slowly while snorkeling, making longer passages tedious and time-consuming. The device created a small wake that could be spotted visually, and its air intake valve sometimes slammed shut when waves washed over it, creating pressure changes inside the submarine that caused severe discomfort to the crew. Most importantly, by the time snorkels became widespread, the Allies had accumulated such advantages in numbers, technology, and experience that even this innovation could not shift the strategic balance.
The technological and intelligence triumph that defeated the Kriegsmarine offers several enduring lessons about military innovation and modern warfare. First, technological superiority alone does not guarantee victory. It must be combined with effective tactics, adequate numbers of platforms to employ the technology, and well-trained personnel. The Allies had developed centimetric radar and improved sonar by 1941, but did not achieve decisive results until 1943, when they also had enough escort vessels and aircraft to apply these technologies across the breadth of the Atlantic. Second, intelligence, particularly signals intelligence from codebreaking, can provide decisive advantages if properly exploited. The ability to read German U-boat communications allowed Allied naval commanders to route convoys away from submarine concentrations, avoiding battles entirely rather than having to win them. Third, security of communications is paramount. The German failure to realize their codes had been broken or to adequately secure their wireless traffic contributed directly to their defeat. The scale of the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic becomes clear when examining the final statistics. Germany began the war with only 57 U-boats, far fewer than Dönitz believed necessary to successfully blockade Britain. By war's end, over 1,100 U-boats had been commissioned. Of these, some 700 were lost to enemy action or accidents. The Kriegsmarine lost 30,000 submariners killed and 5,000 captured, a casualty rate approaching 90%, devastating by any measure. Against this, the U-boats sank approximately 3,000 Allied merchant ships, totaling over 14 million tons, along with hundreds of warships. In the cold mathematics of war, the exchange rate might appear favorable to Germany, but this calculation misses the crucial point. Britain did not starve, did not run out of fuel, and accumulated the resources necessary to sustain the war effort and support the eventual liberation of Europe. The Kriegsmarine failed in its strategic objective of severing Britain's maritime lifelines. The Allies succeeded in keeping those lifelines open. That success proved decisive. The development and application of radar, sonar, and intelligence capabilities during the Battle of the Atlantic marked a turning point in military history. For the first time, technology allowed naval forces to operate effectively in darkness and poor weather, to detect enemies beyond visual range, and to find submarines beneath the ocean's surface. These capabilities, primitive by modern standards, represented revolutionary advances for their time. The principles established during World War II, the integration of sensors, weapons, and intelligence in a coordinated system, the importance of closing technological gaps quickly, and the need for continuous innovation to maintain military advantage remain fundamental to naval warfare today. Modern submarines are vastly more capable than World War II U-boats, but modern anti-submarine forces have advanced even more dramatically, employing satellites, long-range patrol aircraft, sophisticated sonar systems, and underwater sensors that World War II sailors could barely have imagined. The victory in the Atlantic made possible everything that followed in the European theater. The invasion of North Africa in 1942, Sicily and Italy in 1943, and finally Normandy in 1944 all depended on the ability to transport massive quantities of troops, equipment, and supplies across the Atlantic without crippling losses. If the U-boats had succeeded in their campaign, these operations would have been impossible, and the course of the war would have been drastically different.
The men who developed radar and sonar systems, who broke German codes, who flew anti-submarine patrols for hours over empty ocean, and who escorted convoy after convoy through submarine-infested waters, contributed as much to Allied victory as the soldiers who stormed the beaches or the airmen who bombed German cities. Their story is one of scientific ingenuity, technical achievement, dogged perseverance, and extraordinary courage. As the last U-boat surrendered in May 1945, following Germany's capitulation, the full magnitude of the Atlantic struggle became apparent. The ocean floor of the North Atlantic had become a graveyard holding hundreds of ships and thousands of men, German and Allied alike. The battle had consumed vast resources and caused tremendous suffering, but it had also demonstrated the capacity of democratic nations to mobilize scientific and industrial resources for military purposes, to adapt and innovate in the face of deadly threats, and ultimately to prevail through a combination of technological superiority, industrial might, and human determination. The technologies developed during the Battle of the Atlantic, radar, sonar, operational research, and electronic warfare would shape military operations for generations to come, while the intelligence techniques pioneered at Bletchley Park would lay the foundations for modern signals intelligence agencies.
In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic was won not by any single factor, but by the cumulative weight of multiple advantages carefully developed and skillfully applied. Radar found the surfaced submarines. Sonar located them when they dived. Intelligence revealed their positions and intentions. Aircraft and escort vessels hunted them relentlessly. Codebreakers gave commanders the information they needed to outmaneuver the wolf packs. Industrial production provided the ships and aircraft needed to cover the vast expanses of the Atlantic. Training and experience transformed raw recruits into skilled submarine hunters. And through it all, the merchant seamen continued to sail, carrying the cargoes that kept Britain in the war. The Kriegsmarine fought with skill and courage, but faced an enemy that matched them in bravery while surpassing them in resources, innovation, and ultimately effectiveness. The tide had turned, and with it, the outcome of the Second World War was determined as surely as any decision made on the battlefields of Europe or in the halls of power in London, Washington, and Berlin. The technological revolution that turned the tide in the Atlantic did not occur in isolation. It was part of a broader transformation in how modern warfare was conducted. The Battle of the Atlantic became a proving ground for what would later be called systems warfare, where victory depended not on individual weapons or platforms, but on the integration of multiple capabilities into a coordinated whole. This concept would dominate military thinking for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. But in 1943, it was still being discovered through bitter experience and hard-won lessons. The role of operational research in this transformation cannot be overstated. Professor Patrick Blackett, a future Nobel Prize winner in physics, led a team of scientists who applied mathematical and statistical analysis to anti-submarine warfare problems. Their work produced insights that seem obvious in hindsight, but were revelatory at the time. They calculated that larger convoys were safer than smaller ones, because the same number of escort vessels could protect more merchant ships, and because submarines on the periphery of the convoy could only attack the outer ships regardless of how many vessels sailed in the center. They determined that painting aircraft white reduced detection range more than any other color scheme. They proved that attacks on U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, as the submarines transited to and from their French bases, yielded better results per hour of patrol time than random searches in mid-ocean. They calculated optimal spacing for depth charge patterns and demonstrated that shallow set charges were far more effective than had been realized. Each of these findings saved lives and ships. The shift to larger convoys meant fewer total convoys crossing the Atlantic, which stretched escort forces further and reduced the target opportunities available to U-boats. The Bay of Biscay offensive forced U-boats to transit submerged, burning precious battery power and fuel, and inflicted a steady attrition on the submarine fleet. Improved depth charge tactics increased the probability of destroying a submarine once it was detected. Blackett's team and similar groups in Canada and the United States
transformed anti-submarine warfare from an art into a science, applying rigorous analysis to life-and-death questions. Their work represented a new way of thinking about military problems, one that would become standard practice in all modern militaries. The code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park evolved throughout the war, developing techniques and technologies that laid the groundwork for the computer age. The challenge of breaking Enigma required processing vast amounts of encrypted data and testing millions of possible settings to find the correct one. Manual methods proved too slow, so the British developed specialized machines to automate parts of the process. The bomb, an electromechanical device designed by mathematician Alan Turing and engineer Gordon Welchman, could test thousands of Enigma settings per hour, dramatically accelerating the code-breaking process. Later in the war, the Colossus computers, developed to break different German cipher systems, represented the world's first programmable electronic digital computers. The intellectual foundations of the computer revolution were being laid even as the Battle of the Atlantic raged.
The human stories behind the statistics and technology reveal the true nature of the struggle. Consider the experience of a typical convoy voyage in 1942 during the darkest period of the Atlantic battle. A merchant ship would load its cargo in New York, Halifax, or another North American port. Grain, oil, steel, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, whatever Britain desperately needed. The crew, perhaps 40 men, would include experienced seamen and raw recruits, some making their first Atlantic crossing. They knew the odds. They had heard the stories, knew men who had sailed out and never returned. But they loaded the cargo and prepared to sail anyway, because someone had to. The convoy would assemble in a designated area, perhaps 40 or 50 ships forming columns a half-mile apart. Destroyers, corvettes, or other escort vessels would take up positions around the perimeter, usually no more than one escort vessel for every 10 merchant ships. The convoy commodore, typically a retired Royal Navy officer, would signal when to begin the voyage, and the massive formation would set out to sea, steering a zigzag course at 8 or 9 knots, the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. For the first few days, long-range patrol aircraft might provide air cover, circling overhead, searching for submarines. Then the aircraft would turn back, having reached the limit of their range, and the convoy would enter the air gap, that stretch of ocean beyond the reach of land-based planes. This was where the wolf packs waited. The tension would build day by day. Men would scan the horizon constantly, looking for periscopes, torpedo wakes, or the telltale plume of a surfaced submarine. At night, the darkness seemed alive with threats. Orders forbade showing any lights. A single cigarette carelessly lit could make the ship visible for miles. So the convoy sailed in complete blackness. The escorts would patrol back and forth, their sonar operators listening intently for the distinctive echo of a submarine. Sometimes days would pass without incident, and men would begin to hope they might be lucky that the U-boats were hunting elsewhere. Then, without warning, a torpedo would strike. The explosion, a massive, cracking boom followed by the shriek of tearing metal, would jolt men awake. Alarm bells would ring. Men would scramble for lifeboats and life jackets. If they were very lucky, and the torpedo had not struck the engine room or magazine, they might have 5 or 10 minutes before the ship went down. Often, they had much less. The escorts would race toward the sinking ship, searching for the submarine that had attacked. Sometimes they would get a sonar contact and launch a depth charge attack. More often, the submarine would have fired its torpedoes and slipped away, vanishing into the dark ocean. The escort vessels faced an agonizing choice: pursue the submarine, trying to destroy it before it could attack again, or stop to pick up survivors from the sinking ship. Both decisions had terrible consequences. If they stopped to rescue survivors, other submarines might attack the stopped escort or other ships in the convoy. If they maintained the pursuit, men in the water would die of exposure before they could be saved. The doctrine was clear, but brutal. The convoy must come first. Survivors would be rescued if possible, but not at the cost of exposing the convoy to additional attacks. For the men in the water, time became everything. The North Atlantic's temperature rarely exceeds 50 degrees Fahrenheit and in winter drops far lower. Immersion in such water causes rapid heat loss. Consciousness fades within 30 minutes.
Death within 2 hours. Men clung to wreckage, to overturned lifeboats, to each other. They watched their ships disappear beneath the waves, taking with them friends and shipmates who had not made it off. Some sang to keep their spirits up. Some prayed. Some simply endured, waiting and hoping for rescue. If an escort could return after dealing with the submarine threat, or if a rescue ship accompanying the convoy could reach them, they might survive. Many did not. The bodies of merchant seamen who died in the Atlantic rest there still, unmarked and unmourned, except in the memories of those who sailed with them.
The U-boat crews had their own ordeals. Life aboard a Type 7 submarine tested human endurance in ways few other military assignments could match. The boat measured just over 200 feet long and 20 feet wide, with most of that space occupied by machinery, weapons, fuel, and supplies. 50 men lived in the remaining space, sharing bunks in rotation because there were not enough beds for everyone to sleep at once. The interior was a maze of pipes, valves, gauges, and machinery, all of it slick with condensation because the difference between the boat's interior temperature and the cold ocean outside caused constant moisture buildup. The air smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, mildew, and the chemical toilets that were the only sanitation facilities. Fresh water was severely rationed. There was none for bathing, barely enough for drinking and cooking. Men went weeks without washing. Their clothes rotted from the constant damp. Bread turned moldy within days. Fresh food ran out after the first week at sea, replaced by canned goods that grew monotonous after the first month. The psychological strain was as debilitating as the physical hardships. A submarine on patrol might spend weeks without seeing anything but empty ocean. The routine was mind-numbing. Watch duty, sleep, eat, maintain the equipment, repeat. Then, suddenly, a convoy would be sighted, and everything would change. The boat would shadow the convoy, radioing position reports to bring other submarines to the area. When enough boats had assembled, the wolf pack would attack. The submarine would surface at night, running on diesel engines to close with the convoy at high speed. The commander would maneuver into attack position, line up his shot through the periscope or surface attack site, and fire his torpedoes. The wait to see if they hit was excruciating. The weapons took minutes to cover the distance to the target, and there was always the chance they would miss or malfunction. If they hit, the crew would cheer. Another kill to paint on the conning tower. Then the escorts would come, racing toward the submarine's position, and the boat would crash dive, plunging down into the darkness. The depth charge attacks that followed were an ordeal that no amount of training could fully prepare a man to endure. The submarine would go deep as the commander dared, and rig for silent running, shutting down all non-essential machinery to avoid making noise that would help the escorts locate them. The crew would sit in silence, barely breathing, as they listened to the destroyer's propellers passing overhead. Then would come the clicking sounds of depth charges being released, followed by the detonations. The explosions, even when not particularly close, were deafeningly loud inside the submarine's hull. The boat would shudder and lurch. Light bulbs would shatter. Gauges would crack. Cork insulation would rain down from the overhead. If the charges were close, the effects were far worse. Hull plates could buckle. Pipes could rupture, spraying high-pressure seawater or hydraulic fluid. The most dreaded damage was to the batteries, which if cracked would release chlorine gas, a deadly poison that had killed thousands in the trenches of World War I and could kill a submarine crew in minutes. The attacks might continue for hours. The submarine would try to evade, but submerged speed was so slow that an escort could easily keep pace. The commander would order course changes, trying to slip away, but the sonar would find them again, and another pattern of depth charges would explode around them. Air would grow foul as the crew consumed the oxygen and the carbon dioxide scrubbers became saturated. Men would develop splitting headaches. Some would pass out. The pressure inside the boat, normally held slightly above sea pressure to prevent leaks, would drop as compressed air was used to blow ballast or operate equipment. The hull, designed to resist pressure from the outside, would creak and groan under the unaccustomed internal vacuum. Every man would wonder if the next explosion would be the one that crushed the hull, sending thousands of tons of water blasting into the boat in an instant of total destruction. There would be no time to feel pain, no time for fear, just instant death for all aboard. If the submarine survived the attack, eventually the escorts would lose contact or be forced to return to the convoy, which had continued on its way during the battle. The U-boat would remain deep for hours more, just to be certain, before creeping back toward the surface. When they finally surfaced and opened the hatches, the rush of fresh air was like a resurrection. Men would breathe deeply, reveling in air that did not taste of oil and sweat and fear. They would assess the damage, make what repairs they could, and either resume the hunt or limp back to base if the boat was too badly damaged to continue. The survivors would live to fight another day, but the experience would mark them. Veterans could be identified by a peculiar nervous tension that never quite faded, a legacy of hours spent in a steel cylinder while high explosives detonated nearby.
As 1943 progressed and the technological and numerical balance shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, these ordeals became more frequent and the survival rate for U-boats plummeted. The introduction of escort carriers meant that convoys now had air cover even in mid-Atlantic. The small carriers, converted from merchant ship hulls, carried a squadron of aircraft, typically a mix of fighters and anti-submarine patrol planes. These aircraft could search far ahead of the convoy, detecting and attacking U-boats before they could reach attack positions. The psychological effect on submarine crews was profound. Previously, surfacing at night had been relatively safe. Now, aircraft could appear out of the darkness without warning, dropping bombs or depth charges before the submarine could dive. Many U-boats were destroyed in these sudden attacks, blown apart on the surface, or so heavily damaged that they sank before they could submerge. The support groups that became active in 1943 represented another innovation that tilted the balance. These were groups of escort vessels, typically 5 or 6 destroyers or frigates, that did not escort specific convoys but instead operated independently, rushing to assist convoys under attack or hunting submarines in areas where they were known to concentrate. Commanded by experienced anti-submarine warfare specialists and freed from the constraints of maintaining position around a slow-moving convoy, these groups could pursue U-boats aggressively, hunting them for days if necessary until they were destroyed. The second escort group, commanded by Captain Frederick John Walker, became legendary for its success. Walker developed innovative tactics such as the creeping attack, where one ship would hold sonar contact while another crept toward the submarine at very slow speed to avoid being heard, then launched a precisely aimed depth charge attack. Walker's group sank more U-boats than any other Allied force, and Walker himself became the most successful anti-submarine warfare commander of the war before his death in 1944 from exhaustion and stress-related illness. The increasing effectiveness of Allied anti-submarine forces changed the fundamental character of the Atlantic battle. In 1940 and 1941, U-boats hunted convoys. By late 1943, escorts and aircraft hunted U-boats, and the submarines had become the prey. The shift was evident in German tactics. Where once submarines had surfaced to attack at night, they now remained submerged as much as possible. Where once they had stalked convoys relentlessly, they now often broke off contact when faced with aggressive escorts. The hunters had become the hunted, and they knew it. Morale in the U-boat fleet began to crack. Men who had volunteered eagerly in 1939 or 1940, attracted by the prestige of the submarine service and the Knight's Cross medals worn by successful commanders, now went to sea knowing they were unlikely to return. By 1944, U-boat crews were referring to their boats as iron coffins and making grim jokes about seeing you in Valhalla. Dönitz, now Grand Admiral and commander of the entire German Navy after the death of his predecessor in 1943, faced an impossible dilemma. Every rational analysis indicated that the U-boat campaign had failed and continuing operations only wasted lives and resources. But Hitler demanded that the Atlantic War continue, and Dönitz, a loyal Nazi, complied. He convinced himself that even if the U-boats could no longer sink enough ships to matter strategically, they still tied down substantial Allied forces that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere.
There was some truth to this argument. The Allies maintained huge anti-submarine establishments throughout 1944 and 1945. But the cost to Germany was terrible. U-boats that might have been used to defend against the eventual Allied invasion of France or to interdict Soviet supply routes in the Baltic instead sailed into the Atlantic to be destroyed by an enemy that had overwhelming superiority in every dimension of anti-submarine warfare. The final year of the Atlantic battle saw some of the most one-sided naval combat in history. Submarines equipped with snorkels could remain submerged for extended periods, but this did not save them. Allied hunter-killer groups equipped with the latest sonar and radar technology, guided by intelligence from code-breaking and direction-finding, hunted them systematically. The inshore campaign, where U-boats operated in shallow waters close to the British coast, hoping to avoid the mid-ocean hunter-killer groups, proved even more deadly than open ocean operations. The shallow waters that limited the depth to which the submarine could dive also made sonar more effective and gave them nowhere to hide. Minefields closely patrolled by aircraft and surface vessels took a steady toll. Some U-boats were sunk on their first patrol, destroyed before they could attack a single ship. Others survived a patrol or two before meeting their inevitable fate. The lucky few that made it through the war did so more through chance than skill.